For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Lumgile Ngomfe. Joining me today is writer and academic Professor Nicky Falkof, here to discuss her book titled The Devil Made Me Do It, Understanding Occult Crime in South Africa. Your book examines the stories and beliefs behind South Africa's occult crimes. What informed your decision to write this book, and has writing this book brought you any closer to meaningfully understanding South Africa's collective psyche?
The honest answer is that the reason I wrote this book is that I was approached by Penguin. And you don't say no to a publisher of that stature. It was actually their idea that they thought a book on occult crime would be of interest to the broader market. And at first I was a bit resistant because I have already written on this topic quite a lot. My PhD was about the satanic panic in the 1980s. And that then got turned into a book, my first book that I published in South Africa, The End of Whiteness, that I published with Chicana. So I was a little bit wary. I was like, oh, do I need to retread this? And then I started looking at what they actually wanted, and I started looking at what I actually thought, and some other research that I've done in between. And I realized that this was actually an incredible opportunity to take some of the arguments that I'd been making specifically about white people and white culture towards the end of apartheid and broaden those out. Firstly, in terms of time, and secondly, in terms of the communities that I'm talking about, to try and make an argument that shows that the things I was saying about white South Africans in the 1980s, about how occult anxieties are generally symbolic of other things. They generally actually point to problems, social problems, problems of politics, problems of narrative, problems of identity. That I could take that argument and apply it much more broadly across South Africa. And that was a really enticing thing to be allowed to do. And also, another thing for me that was really valuable about this, again, was publishing with Penguin, which is not a scholarly publisher. So, I've done so many academic books, which obviously I am incredibly proud of, and I've been able to work with some amazing publishers. But to be given the opportunity to write in a way that is deeply unacademic is so wonderful that, the person, Karen Morn, the journalist who did my Joburg book launch with me, gave me the biggest compliment I've had on a book in a really long time. She said she read it in 2 days. So for an academic who spends a lot of time immersed in quite complex theory that can often make your work much richer, but also inaccessible for a lot of people. It really is a wonderfully pleasing challenge and quite a joy to be able to write for a broader audience in this way. So I think as a writer, I think I gained quite a lot from the experience. And I think as a person who thinks a lot about South Africa and about race and about identity and about cities and about how society works in this country, I think I really learned a lot from thinking about how these same kinds of trends manifest among very, very different people from very different class, racial, historical backgrounds.
And can you talk about the relationship between African mythologies and occult crimes? And how did the Rex versus Mbombela legal case challenge Western legal thought and the ways that South African laws were applied to occult crimes?
Well, the Rex v. Mbombela case actually didn't challenge Western legal thought. What the Rex v. Mbombela case did was actually entrench Western legal thought. It officially told the Western legal system, the colonial legal system, that it was perfectly legitimate, both legally and ethically, to dismiss the beliefs of the black majority of this country as simply unreasonable and as ridiculous and as not necessarily something that should be taken into account when it came to understanding how and why violent crimes happened. And of course, that's a huge, huge mistake. If you don't understand people's worldviews and how their worldviews may play into the way that they behave, you will never be able to impact on the way that they behave in any way. But I'm not suggesting that we have to be so immersed in this narrative of occult crime that we use it as an excuse, that we go, yes, someone was possessed by the devil, or someone was attacked by a tokoloshe, or someone did do a satanic ritual, and therefore their crime is acceptable. It's not acceptable, but if we don't understand why they have that belief system and why that belief system might impact on the kind of thing that they do on a daily basis, on their kind of social practice, then we're never going to understand how we can change people's social practices and have any real effect on rates of violence in this country. And I think that there has been, obviously, this has shifted enormously, but there has been a tendency in the law to dismiss African indigenous belief systems as simply, meaningless and silly and not worthy of careful consideration. But at the same time, if you look at some of the cases that I've written about around so-called Satanism, which often features white people and is often framed within a Christian understanding of good and evil that's more recognizable to the Christianized legal system, in those cases, the occult and supernatural are taken much more seriously, where courts will go, okay, were you possessed in this instance? Let's think about that carefully. Okay, no, you weren't possessed. Fine, you're going to jail. But they will acknowledge that possession is a possibility in a way that for a long time, courts in our country would not be willing to think about African indigenous beliefs and practices in any way that acknowledge that they might have some validity or even some validity in people, the way that people behaved.
How did the cultural differences of South African people factor into your understanding of occult crimes?
As I said before, I think cultural background is crucial in trying to understand why occult and supernatural beliefs may lead to violent crime, but also in trying to understand how we as a society process and react to occult and supernatural crimes, right? If you come from a background where belief in the tokoloshe or belief in a satanic cult is normal and normalized and common and not in any way spectacular or astonishing, then it will make more sense to you to understand certain kinds of crimes in that way. So, yes, people's cultural differences are hugely impactful in how they respond to stories of so-called occult crime. But in other ways, the differences between us are not necessarily as stark as we might think. If you scratch the surface of a lot of so-called occult crimes, you find very similar stories underneath. If you scratch the surface of muti murders, or of satanic murders perpetrated by high school, so-called satanic murders perpetrated by high school students, you will often find that what's underpinning this kind of violence is people's desire for power. Very precarious people with little opportunity for social mobility, hearing stories that fit within their cultural belief system, saying, if you do this thing, you will be able to be more powerful, and going, okay, I'll give it a try. And of course, it doesn't work. But that's not the point. The point is underpinning so much of this stuff is a kind of a generalized sense that inequality is not shiftable and justice is not attainable. And so violence begins to feel like a legitimate way for people to change their lives, their own personal lives, because they see that the system is not working. It's not working for them. It's only working for a very, very small elite. And I think there are a lot of places that have very intense understandings of the occult, very intense supernatural beliefs that impact on how society works. But in our country, I think that often explodes into violence because what you have is this thick, powerful, cross-cultural narrative of the close presence of the supernatural, and that intersects with powerful and deeply, deeply damaging and distressing awarenesses of the failed promises of 1994, the pervasiveness of inequality, and the impossibility of having a good life.
And can you detail the context behind the Satanic Panic, which engulfed South Africa during the 1980s and 90s, and the effects that this would have on young white teenagers at the time?
This is my pet topic because, as I say in the book, I was a teenage goth and got really caught up in this Satanism scare. Interestingly, I did a radio interview on this topic, and there was a caller who called in and said, well, this is absolute nonsense. There's absolutely no link between apartheid and Satanism. You're absolutely grasping at straws. I don't believe any of this. La 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 la. Older white woman thinking this is ridiculous. And the thing is, people do counter these ideas of mine, but I stand by this really, really strongly. If you look at how the Satanism scare played out in South Africa, in many ways it was a disciplinary mechanism. And I'm not saying anyone did this on purpose or there was a secret government department planning a Satanism scare. That's not how these phenomena happen. They bubble up from the bottom and are embedded by people with more power at the top. But during the last years of apartheid, what was becoming clear is that the system was disintegrating. Things were shifting. It was very clear to many people that the white state was not sustainable. And apartheid has always or rather had that form of apartheid. It always legitimated itself. It always operated on the complicity of white people. Whether these were white people who actively voted for the National Party, whether these were white people who actively performed violent racism in their daily lives, the fact that white people were not resisting apartheid en masse is one of the main ways in which apartheid managed to last for so long. And one of the reasons that white people did not resist apartheid en masse, even if they personally, deep in their hearts, felt like it was a bit wrong, was because they were terrified. The apartheid state was incredibly skillful at manipulating and weaponizing white people's fear in order to retain power. Part of that fear was the fear of the so-called race war, that if we gave up power to them, then your maids and gardeners would come with a panga and kill you in your sleep. This is at the same time as these maids and gardeners are being spoken about as being like family and are being allowed into your home to care for your children. It's a really weird apartheid era or colonial in general contradiction. And one of the other things that really threatened the continuation of the white apartheid state was the youth. So young people, if young people were rebelling, if young people were not doing what they were meant to do, they were not getting married and having, appropriate numbers of children. They were not going to work in the right kinds of jobs. They were not voting in the right way, which is the most basic part of this. If young people were not coming to the party, then the state was doomed. Then the white Christian state was really going to be in a lot of trouble. So when we look back at the Satanism scare and how it demonized and dehumanized white kids who rebelled and didn't rebel politically, as gothy teenagers, we weren't joining the UDM, we weren't going into exile. We were just listening to the Sisters of Mercy and maybe smoking some marijuana and wearing black a lot. But we became symbolic of the imminent collapse of society because apartheid depended so strongly on youth conformity, which led, of course, to adult conformity. So one of the things that the Satanism scare did was it actually showed young white people, if you step out of line, this is what happens. You become the devil. You become the worst possible thing that you could imagine. You can't even do normal teenage rebellion without being told that you're a race traitor and a traitor to your country. So it really was very effective in a lot of ways, but of course, in a lot of other ways, it wasn't, because what happens when you tell rebellious teenagers not to rebel? They rebel more. So in some ways, I do think, even though it was a really minor phenomenon that happened as part of much greater social currents towards the end of apartheid, I do think that the panic around Satanism in some way contributed to a general consciousness among a certain group of people in my generation who were like, actually, we don't need to, this is nonsense. And it didn't lead us to storming the barricades, but it did lead to a change in thinking that potentially had broader effects.
Now, Prof, with individual liberty and personal responsibility in mind, are these incidences not examples of people using occult beliefs to excuse wrongful behavior and an inability to deal with the diversity of a pluralistic world? Or are there specific cultural nuances and practices that could further be examined to accurately understand where this type of phenomena comes from?
I mean, I think the main thing to consider when it comes down to this is that occult crimes are often not occult crimes. There's often really nothing to do with the occult, right? Usually the people who do these sorts of terrible things are not being possessed by the devil. Nothing that, there's nothing supernatural about this except for their personal belief system. So what you will find is that someone will commit a murder and there will be a black candle and a pentagram at the murder site, and everyone will go, woo, occult crime, occult crime. We need to pray more in schools. We need to call in occult police managers. We need to call in Pentecostal preachers. We need to, exorcise everything, and then it'll all be okay. There was a really wonderful article by the journalist Jacques Rousseau, which is old now. It's like back from 2013, I think, where he's talking about the occult related crimes unit of the South African Police Service. And he says, we don't have a special unit for crimes that are motivated by jealousy. We don't have a special unit for crimes that are motivated by lust or crimes that are motivated by anger. Why do we have a special unit for crimes that are motivated by people's belief in the supernatural? And I think it's a really good point that in many instances, the people who are capable of doing these things might have been capable of doing them anyway. And the diagnosis of occult crime is something that we and they apply afterwards. So understanding something as part of a kind of an indigenous belief system or a Christianized belief system, this helps us to understand what might have allowed the perpetrator to explain to themselves why they did what they did. But it doesn't help us to understand why the rates of crime and violence in this country are so high, because really, The diagnosis of a satanic crime, the claim of an occult crime, is just another reason for violence. And there are many, many, many reasons for violence in this very violent country. So why do we treat this one so differently? Why do we treat it as though it deserves special consideration in multiple ways when really it's just another explanation for something that is endemic and something that is a social, not a spiritual problem?
Do you think South Africa has truly moved beyond the anxieties that fed the satanic panic, or do you think that they resurface under new guises today?
I love that question. And absolutely, I think they resurface. To contextualize this, South Africa was not the only place that had a satanic panic at this particular point in history. Very famously, there was one in the US that led to accusations of pedophilia at lots of daycares, and lots of places were shut down and people were arrested and lives were ruined. Similar things happened in the UK, similar things happened in places like Norway, but also in Turkey and Egypt, there were Satanism scares at that point in history. And what are we seeing now? Years after, decades after, we're seeing this spike in populism. We're seeing the rise of aggressive, violent, toxically masculine leaders like Trump. And we're also seeing concurrently the rise of narratives like QAnon, which is the satanic panic in different form, right? These conspiracy theories do not go away. They bubble up to the surface seemingly when we need them, or when there is an explosion of mass anxiety, or something happens politically, socially, historically, economically, and people need a way to explain it to themselves. These stories bubble up and then they bubble down again, and then they pop up and they change, but elements of them remain the same. One of the most interesting things for me about doing this kind of research on these phenomena that, academics call moral panics, is that the content of moral panics is often very, very similar. So if you look at moral panics around alleged child murder by Jews in Eastern Europe in the 1800s, and then you look at moral panics around the threat posed by violent, pedophiliac, sneaky, youth corrupting communists in the US in the 60s, and then you look at narratives and discourses around Satanists in the 80s and 90s, you see the same stories popping up over and over again. The same ideas of what characterizes these particular bad, scary, evil people who are threats to society. So the stories don't go away. They just come up again when we need them. And again, in South Africa, we see this repeatedly. Like, one thing for me that's been really interesting that I didn't manage to fit into this book has been the intersection of South African xenophobia, or that South African Afrophobia, and South African fears of the occult. So, if there was a certain point where if you spent a lot of time on Twitter, you would be assailed with stories of Nigerian trafficking gangs that used Nigerian versions of muti to get women and girls and do terrible things to them sexually and kill them in very, very violent ways and do terrible things to their bodies. And there may be some truth in that story, because we do have problems of trafficking in this country, and we do have problems of gender-based violence. But what we don't know, what we don't have any evidence for, is the fact that Nigerian mystical magician devilish Satanists were behind this and were using magic to do it. But because there is a real thing to be afraid of, the same old story that we've been telling ourselves for decades about what we really need to fear pops up and helps us to explain a new and frightening and troubling threat.
That was Professor Nicky Falkof discussing a book titled The Devil Made Me Do It, Understanding Occult Crime in South Africa. Visit the Polity website for more author interviews, news, and information updates. And don't forget to subscribe to Polity's daily email newsletter.